Well, it's a pleasure to be with you all, and thank you so much for helping us to have an outstanding convention. And before we get started, when I think about events like this, they don't come together out of nowhere. They're sound engineers, they're photographers, they're the people who put down our napkins and take away our forks and spoons. And if we could begin by just giving them a round of applause. So before we get started, I'm tasked with a few housekeeping responsibilities, and then we'll get right to the thick of it. All right, so the first, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. Please just take a look. I've been asked to share this. Supposedly they've been just going off, binging and beaming all over the place. The next is that we're engaged with social media. So if you would like to tweet about a session, then please make a note of using the hashtag ACS 2022. Okay? For CLE credits, the way this is going to take place to make sure that you stay in the room, although I know everybody here would want to stay in the room, we're going to start off with the first code, and at the end, I hope to remember to give you the second code. Someone will cue me for that. But the first, for those of you who are logging in right now, the code is SCUBA, S-C-U-B-A. So if you're logging in for CLEs, then that is it. You'll notice that there are index cards at your tables. That's so that if you have any questions for the panel, please feel free to write your question down, and then you can raise a hand and someone will be around at the appropriate time to pick it up. I've been promised. Okay, all right. And with that, I think that we're ready then to begin the show in a moment. All right. You know we are really live. All right, I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get straight to the thick of the conversation. Immediately to my left is Julie Kay, a well-known litigator and voice advocating for reproductive freedom worldwide, has been instrumental to the falling of anti-abortion provisions, particularly in Ireland, and spreading word about this and impact globally. She combines legal expertise with personal narrative to bring an understanding of the legal issues and the pressing need for activism that is inclusive and human rights based. She's an attorney who designed and litigated the landmark abortion rights case ABC versus Ireland before the European Court of Human Rights. And her new book of Controlling Women, What We Must Do Now to Save Reproductive Freedom, co-authored with Catherine Colbert, proposes audacious new strategies inspired by medical advances, state-level protections, human rights models, and activism across the globe. Immediately to the left, and still getting mic'd, is Roseanne Maria Purim. Yes, give it up for her. Absolutely. Most of us don't have to do this in front of a full audience and crowd of at least a couple hundred people here. She's the executive director of Jane's Due Process. Jane's Due Process, woo! And you got folks in the audience. Texas is deep. I think that's probably Texas. How many of you are from Texas? Texas in the house? Okay, there you go. We need Texas in the house. All right, Jane's Due Process fights for teens' reproductive freedom in Texas by helping young people confidentially access abortion and birth control. She has worked on the state and national levels in reproductive health, rights, and justice for over the last decade. And then following to my most left is Erin Martin. Erin is the director of nominations and cross-cutting policies at the National Women's Law Center, where she leads the law center's advocacy on judicial nominations, critically important, and cross-cutting policy work. Prior to joining the National Women's Law Center, she served as senior policy counsel for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and as a staff attorney at the Center for Reproductive Rights. So thank you very much. Can we give a round of applause to Julie, Roseanne, and Erin? Okay, so let's get this conversation started. You'll see me peer at my phone. That is just so that I can make sure that we keep on time. All right, so my first question is, what the hell is going on, right? How do we make sense of a leaked draft opinion that portends the overturn of Roe v. Wade? And I'll start with that question with you, Erin. How do you think we got here? $1 million question, isn't it?
I think we got here over, it's been 50 years almost since Roe was decided, and that's at the point when Republicans decided that they wanted to start to overturn it. I think we've seen it revved up over the past 4 or 5 years, especially with the Trump administration when he was on the campaign trail and said that he was going to nominate judges who would overturn our right to abortion. And that's what he did. He nominated and had 3 justices confirmed. And I think he even stated on the campaign trail that it would happen pretty rapidly. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing right now.
And with this, we'll be having a conversation. Just kind of imagine us with drinks and a dinner party, and you just get to watch. But when you say, one of the things that I'm thinking about, and I completely agree with you on the point that Donald Trump said, what I'm going to do is to nominate judges who are going to overturn Roe. And even before that, he said, who will punish women who have had abortions. But when I think about this, the Republican platform 50 years ago wasn't actually this, right? I mean, there was the fringe, and they weren't even necessarily Republican, right? 50 years ago, Roe v. Wade is a 7-2 opinion. 5 of those 7 justices were Republican. Justice Blackmun, who wrote the opinion in Roe v. Wade, was put on the court by Richard Nixon. No one would say he was a radical lefty, right? Like Nixon, right? So I wonder then, what more has happened to contextualize that in terms of how we got here? And Roseanne, maybe you have some insights on that in terms of this kind of shift that has taken place over the last 49 years.
Sure, I can try. So definitely living in Texas, I think it's interesting talking to people there who remember when our state house, there was Ann Richards, there was a Democratic majority. And then also there was a commitment to sort of working together on things. There wasn't this huge division over these issues that allowed for nothing to move forward. And I think the change in the state houses was intentional. They weaponized abortion, they used it to motivate voters, and that's what's happened right now, right? Like we're about to go into midterms, and we're also about to face Roe v. Wade being overturned.
Which is an important point that we'll come back to. This point about the intentional weaponization in this space, the intentional turn to state houses, because I'm also curious about what that means in terms of how we understand this broader moment, January 6th, the rise of Christian nationalism, the rise of white supremacy in the United States, a kind of terminology that people would have shrugged, or even worse, if you said it 10 years ago, there is no white supremacy. We are post-racial. Don't you see a black guy in the White House? And how that disconnect plays into this moment, I think we need to get into that. All right, so standing apart, looking at the United States, how do you think that those who are in Europe and other parts of the world are seeing the space that we're in now in the United States with the dismantling, I think not just of reproductive health rights and justice, but it's broader and deeper. I mean, we had a coup a year ago.
Right. I remember explaining to people, or trying to explain to people in Ireland, how George W. Bush got elected a second time. So we've come a long way, baby. And then having the Trump administration.
And you can do this when you feel it. That was, I think for some of you, you were feeling that.
Don't encourage me. But I think that we've had these shifts that have been, I think, more gradual. We are no longer sort of the shining city on the hill that we were post-World War II. And in one of the earlier panels, we were talking about American exceptionalism, and the home of the free and the brave is something that is on a lot of bumper stickers, but we really don't have the kind of baseline human rights that the rest of the world has. We're one of the very few countries that hasn't ratified the Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, otherwise known as CEDAW. We don't take the UN reporting nearly as seriously as we should. We buy our way out of a lot of things. I do love my country. I've done, I think, a lot of criticizing of it, and I think there are a lot of things that are strong in this country, but when we look at access to health care, when we look at access to the courts, those fundamental human rights, we're not doing so well, and we haven't been for a long time. When you talk about sort of what's different and shifting, I think ever since Planned Parenthood versus Casey, we've seen more and more and more limitations put on access to abortion that have fallen very disproportionately on marginalized people, on teens, on people in rural areas, on low-income women, and disproportionately on people of color in this country. And so now we're all having this wake-up moment when it's affecting a broader population, and certainly much more dramatically, and I'm not undermining what's coming with Dobbs, but things weren't so good before they got worse, and I think the rest of the world maybe has seen that happen even before we have.
Well, that's a really good point that you make, because Roe itself was not necessarily a North Star. And I think that there are communities within the United States that already saw this coming, but had already been rendered invisible. So maybe why don't we start first with thinking about what Roe actually did to just help folks who are committed and know something about the issue, but maybe don't really fully understand what Roe represented. Do you want to start with that, Julie?
Yeah, I can keep it brief since most people in law school are done for the year, but it really was centered on the right to privacy, and it was the court responding, I think, to the cultural times where abortion was fairly readily available to people with means in Colorado, New York, and other places. Both in the US and outside. And so the Supreme Court was not looking to kind of, rush to the barricades and find gender equality. In fact, this was very much a decision that allowed women with their doctors, presumably, white men in white coats, to make a decision within the first trimester of abortion. It could be for sort of without restriction. By the second trimester, you were looking at restrictions, but only to promote the woman or the person having an abortion's health. And by the third trimester, at the point of viability, the court could then say that states could put bans on abortion, but there had to be exceptions to save a person's life or health. So it was a compromise, it was a workable solution, but it was based on a privacy right because that's kind of what worked at the time, and not the equality notion that I think you were sort of referencing before, and certainly didn't look at any kind of intersectionality.
It's interesting in terms of what comes after with the Hyde Amendment, and even what comes before then, because a lot of people don't necessarily know about Skinner v. Oklahoma. And so there's a way in which Justice Alito, in this nearly 100-page leaked draft opinion, centers a conversation about reproductive rights just at Roe. But 30 years before Roe v. Wade, there was a case, Skinner v. Oklahoma, where the court used the language of civil rights and human rights to strike down an Oklahoma law that affected men who could be sterilized against their will. Anybody want to speak a little bit to Skinner v. Oklahoma at all? Well, we're like, no, it's like you're a professor. That's clearly what you want to do. Okay, but it's worth taking that note that it's not just Roe, right? I mean, it's not just 49 years ago. 30 years before Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court used the language of human rights and civil rights to talk about the importance of people's own ability to make reproductive health care decisions. And I think that's a really important piece within the broader aspect of what this is all about. After Roe, there are critiques about Roe not being enough, particularly related to the Hyde Amendment, right? So Roseanne, would you want to touch on that a bit? What was the Hyde Amendment, and how is it that somehow affected then how more vulnerable women of color, low income, women who have low incomes, whether they had meaningful access to what Roe promised?
Sure. So I think there's a saying we have in the abortion rights movement, which is Roe is the floor, not the ceiling. And it's because it left out all those communities you just mentioned. And I want to name that Reproductive Justice Advocates, which is a movement that's founded by Black women in the 1990s, and to this day has been calling out the lack of access for folks who are poor, who are people of color, for immigrants. when we talk about the Hyde Amendment, it's a federal ban on any money going towards abortion, including public health insurance. So the people with the least means who deserve support getting abortion care cannot. And I live in a state that also banned private health insurance from covering abortion care. So every single person in Texas is paying out of pocket. And procedures cost hundreds of dollars. So I'm actually wearing a shirt from the National Network.
What does it say?
It says, "Everyone loves someone who has had an abortion." And that saying is from the National Network of Abortion Funds. And abortion funds are charities that help people pay for their abortions, and especially right now, help pay for traveling out of our state of Texas to states where they can get care. And that adds thousands of dollars. I mean, many of us had to buy plane tickets to get here. Imagine having to suddenly find several $1,000s just to get health care. And the reason you're also pursuing that is because you've realized that you don't want to continue this pregnancy. 6 in 10 people who have abortions are already parents. These are people making decisions about their lives. So I think abortion funds play an incredible role right now, and I want to encourage everyone to go to abortionfunds.org, figure out your local abortion fund. Jane's Due Process is one that focuses on youth in Texas, but abortion funds are really going to be critical if we lose Roe.
You're in Texas, and you're doing this work in Texas, and so we really need to talk about SB 8, which, if we're thinking about a Supreme Court term, it really helped to launch, in some ways, the term, and what's going to end the term happens to be the Dobbs case, which comes out of Mississippi. Can you tell us a bit about this Texas law, SB 8, and why it is so incredibly alarming, not just as we think about reproductive health rights and justice, but really our democracy?
Whew.
You can just start off with just telling us about the law itself, and then we'll talk about what it represents.
So SB 8 was passed during our past legislative session, and it took effect on September 1st. It's been in effect for 9 months, which, if you think about that, means that people who got pregnant in September are giving birth now. It bans abortion around 6 weeks. They called it the heartbeat bill, even though there is not a heartbeat at that point in a pregnancy. It is all out of an effort to really ban abortion fully, because most people don't know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. But it was, I think, a really good way for the court to kind of test what would happen if they just let an abortion ban in one of the largest states in the country take effect. And living under it for 9 months, I've seen so many people denied access to healthcare, and then to be pregnant and parenting in Texas is really dangerous. Our state doesn't support, healthcare and housing and food for pregnant and parenting people, especially teenagers.
It hasn't expanded Medicaid.
It hasn't expanded Medicaid, so I think Texas has been a test case to see what it's going to look like in the rest of the country.
And it strikes me that there are other features of the Texas law that are important to the broader discussion about abortion bans taking place. For example, it provides no exception for cases of rape or incest.
Correct.
At all. In addition to that, it has this unique feature which allows for people to sue individuals who aid or abet people with terminating a pregnancy, which strikes me as a feature straight out of the Fugitive Slave Act, right? This kind of surveilling and so forth, spying upon and then calling to account. As we think about where we are in this space, something that you touched on in terms of how dangerous it is in Texas, and Erin, I want your opinion on this, or to get you in the conversation about this. We have alarming rates of maternal mortality in the United States. Black women are 3.5 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than their white counterparts. We know that Texas has been considered the most dangerous place in all of the industrialized world for a person to be pregnant, coming from data in that state. I mean, overall in the US, we rank 55th in the world, but Texas and Mississippi and Louisiana have been considered like the most dangerous places. So Erin, from your lane, when you think about that aspect of where we are in this debate, what's your sense of it? How do you respond to that, knowing how glaring that is, these statistics, and yet we still see the proliferation of these anti-abortion measures?
I think from the court's perspective, it's kind of, as you shared it was their test case for them allowing the decision allowing the law to take effect. I think it was still a bit jarring, honestly, to see it take effect, and also knowing that the lack of maternal health care in the country is awful, specifically for Black women. and I'm not a maternal mortality expert, but I will say I think that it's something we've been pushing for on the judicial nomination space, is just making sure that we have the importance of nominating like Black women, women of color to the judiciary who actually understand the impact of the laws and the landscape across the country for how the laws impact the lives of women of color. And I think that's something we can applaud the Biden administration on in terms of the number of Black women they've nominated to the circuit courts and to the district courts as well, because I think they're having that broader understanding of these laws. And hopefully in the long run, we'll see change, but I know it's not immediate response to addressing these issues.
Right. Well, I mean, what you're saying is critically important, which is that it really does matter who's in the room, who is able to sit at the table, and who is able to make decisions about these various matters. And to that point, just a shout out, who's here from Georgia? We got folks from Georgia who are here. Hello, because thank you, Georgia, for making sure that we could have a Black woman who will go on to the United States Supreme Court. Thank you, Stacey Abrams, and all of the Black women there who made that happen, right? Because that is really the point, isn't it, right? Who gets to be able to sit at the table in the process that goes along with being able to do that? So what do you think is going to happen, right? I mean, we're every day people have been on pins and needles about what decision might possibly come from the court. What's your sense, given the leaked draft opinion?
Yeah, I tend to be an optimist, and yet, I was shocked that the SB 8 in Texas was allowed to go into effect. I did not think that the court would let something kind of run like a brush fire. Because I'm a rules girl, I'm a lawyer. I looked at, I love creative lawyering, but this was, nuts that you could have any kind of vigilante walk down the street and accuse a guidance counselor, a parent, a car driver, anybody.
The person driving the Lyft.
Yeah. And I mean, anybody who was trying to assist, and I think that it's part of this whole process of really chilling anybody from stepping in to help anybody who's seeking an abortion. And one of the things that really concerns me, the maternal mortality rate, I think, is one blatant example of the racism that runs through our healthcare system. We're looking at now merging a healthcare system with a racist criminal justice system. And if you want to think about who's going to get prosecuted, who's going to get investigated for a miscarriage, who's going to end up being put into that position, it's going to be predominantly people of color and Black people in this country. Right. And so that's what kind of, I think, scares me in a way, because we are finally, I think, at the point where we're recognizing some more of the problems of mass incarceration and racism and policing, and now we're throwing in the gender package of stereotype and the attempts to control women's sexuality and gender sexuality.
And we've seen that before. I mean, I think that that's part of what you're saying, right? I mean, this is part of what, Roseanne, you were mentioning in terms of the reproductive justice movement itself and Black women calling to account these spaces, because in the 80s and 90s, there were Black women being dragged out of hospitals in shackles and chains. Black women who wanted to be able to stay pregnant and with dignity and had actually sought prenatal care, being targeted and arrested with their doctors and nurses serving as snitches, right? That's the term that Paul Butler, shout out to Paul, gave me years ago. Michelle, those folks are snitches when they're doing that. So thank you, Paul. That's the term I use, snitches, right? But that was the result. And so what you're saying is that, we've already seen this before. All we had to do is look back at the playbook, and those were folks that weren't even seeking an abortion.
Right.
Who were being shackled during delivery, giving birth in a prison toilet or a prison floor, as if that's dignified. And so what's to come now when a person would like to terminate a pregnancy and hasn't, or has had a stillbirth or a miscarriage, which we saw those prosecutions too.
Well, and I think I would add to your snitches category, the fraidy cats. Yes. I think that we're going to see more of the fraidy cats coming, because what you see when abortion is criminalized, and I think we've seen this in Texas as well too, if people just take a big step back. So you could have medical providers who are very dedicated to their patients, to their profession, but when you think that if there's a heartbeat and if you have a person who's pregnant pregnant or is having complications and there's a heartbeat, that's when physicians and medical providers step way back. And we've seen tragic results. In Ireland, there was the case of Savita Halappanavar, who had a pregnancy that went, she was having a miscarriage. She was untreated because the doctors did not know what to do. They were in a country where there was a constitutional ban on all abortion except life-saving abortions. And I have seen the same thing in this country too, in a case in the 90s that I did at the Center for Reproductive Rights around a woman in a Louisiana state hospital who was getting cardiac care, who became pregnant. Her own cardiac team would not refer her for abortion services because they said her life was at risk, but it wasn't a greater than 50% chance of dying, and therefore she couldn't. So yes, there are a lot of snitches. There are a lot of people who have bad intent on this, but there's also a lot of people who just are deer in the headlight, don't know what to do, don't know how to provide services.
Well, in part, that's because they're also being threatened too, right? I mean, that's part of what you're seeing in the story of Texas as well, and what you've seen in Texas over time, right, with targeted regulations of abortion providers, right? So people have heard that term, and they've heard, trap laws. You can just give a general overview of what a trap law is, because that feeds into why folks have become nervous in recent years. That wasn't the case with Black and brown women back in the day. That was just, people are used to treating poor Black and brown women poorly, right? But recently, Texas has taken it to a whole new level.
Yes, so I mean, Texas, it's not its first rodeo at the Supreme Court. I want to shout out the Center for Reproductive Rights because I feel like they've been defending Texas abortion providers in cases like Whole Women's Health, which was the big trap law case that went up to the Supreme Court. And it's actually when I was in law school, it was my first year. It was the first time I was ever at the court. I was hearing oral arguments for that case. But targeted regulations of abortion providers try to make clinics and doctors and staff go through these ginormous hoops just to provide some of the safest healthcare there is. And so, in that case was that clinics had to be ambulatory surgery centers, even just to distribute the abortion pill, and also that they had to have admitting privileges at local hospitals, which gets to abortion stigma, because the doctors and staff who provide abortion care are so deeply stigmatized and harassed and marginalized, and this was pushing it further because many hospitals wouldn't grant admitting privileges to doctors who provide abortion care.
Yeah, and as Justice Breyer said in Whole Women's Health, it's not as if these were even needed. There's a point, Julie, that you made earlier about how there's this kind of US exceptionalism. We don't have to pay attention elsewhere. Well, the World Health Organization has said for a very long time an abortion is as safe as a penicillin shot, right? So there's something to be said about the way in which there's been the narrative of abortion that has been deeply stigmatized, right? We know that a woman is 14 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. But the way in which this kind of linguistic around this has been framed, you'd think that it was something absolutely different than that. So how does one begin to address then, a kind of counter to this space that we're in? And I do want us to go back to this leaked draft opinion as well, because that's very rich. But how does one counter? I mean, Erin, you mentioned the importance of our courts, and that is critical, and maybe we'll start there.
I think, wait, sorry, do you want me to touch on the...
About how do we respond? Yeah, and then if you want to dive into that leaked draft opinion, that's fine too.
Okay. In terms of thinking about how to respond, I think for the court's angle, and I think it's kind of more broadly tied to our democracy as a whole, is that education. We have to start educating the broader public about what abortion looks like and what it actually looks like. Because I think some people feed into that narrative that anti-abortion folks have, that abortion is risky, that it's like a terrible decision, that everyone's traumatized after they have one. And I think we have to start sharing more real abortion stories for folks to understand like what it actually looks like and what people, the decision-making process and how personal it is and why it should be between the person having an abortion and their doctor. And I think that the courts should recognize that as well, and hope, I'm fingers crossed, even though I know what we likely will see and then later this month, but still being an optimist like Julia.
That's delusional. No, excuse me.
But turning to the draft opinion, I think something that stood out to me from it is just kind of who benefits from it. And I think, it definitely seems like it's either trying to push conservatives to take that, to go full gung-ho for it. But I think for folks who who support abortion rights, it was a wake-up call in terms of organizing and starting that broader public conversation, and for people to kind of start realizing these are the states that we need to start mobilizing in to protect access to abortion. And I think we're seeing that happen, and hopefully it'll be the continuing buildup of a movement for it. And I think folks need to realize that it will take time. There won't be a quick fix, but I think starting with educating the public around abortion and starting that movement building and thinking about who's running our state houses, who's on our state courts, and getting involved.
Well, right, because these aren't issues that are just at the federal level. These are issues that affect people's lives at the ground level. Another administrative task that I've just been signaled to do, which is the second CLE, okay, which is the code is SAND, S-A-N-D. And that's it, right? I'm done with the CLE part. Okay, all right. Now back to abortion and the delusion that optimism
That was really
made.
mean,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I share you in that hope.
I'm trying to be optimistic for everyone.
Well, right, but to your point, perhaps it is hard to be optimistic in some ways. I mean, I think there's the long journey silver lining. I do believe in that, right? I mean, I think that there are populations of people who would not be here today, but for their journey of optimism. You know, sometimes I like to pause and just say, you know, what was the story that a black mom had to tell her child the night before the slave auction, the night before she's going to be sold off, or her child? What message does she give to that child to tell that child, you are human, despite what these people who are about to purchase you will say? You do have value and you do have meaning, despite the fact that you are not recognized in law as a person. And people will say you have no higher dignity than a mule in the field or a cow. But you stay strong, and just know I may never see you again, but you keep hope inside. So there is something to be said about optimism, while at the same time it looks absolutely delusional, what we saw in that leaked draft
Well,
opinion.
and I shouldn't be flippant, but I think that the leaked opinion is still stunning, and I do hold out hope, because to me and to many of us, it's a human rights issue, and it's about not being cruel, and it's about not forcing pregnancy. And so it's very hard to think that this is coming. And, you know, I hear a lot of people who were, you know, remember the days before Roe, and they're like, you know, these younger people, they don't appreciate this and that. And I don't believe that for a second. I think that people, quote, take their rights for granted because they're fundamental human rights, and we know it. And we know that nobody should be forced to decide when and whether and whom to have a child with or not, that they, you know, everybody should be able to make that decision freely and with resources and make a decision of whether or not to have a child and when. And I think that that's part of the whole picture. So I find it hard to believe where our country is, but I am an optimist long term. You know, as Roseanne said, also we have to support the people immediately who are going to be harmed. We have to support the funds, the groups that are working on the ground, many of which are upstanding 501c3s, and many which are people who are, you know, abortion freedom fighters, others who are going to get medication abortion into people's hands, because that is a safe and effective way for many people who either can't or don't want to travel. And we're a lot of lawyers in a room here. We have to provide pro bono legal services, both to help people who are arrested or incarcerated. I've been trying to get off the ground this campaign of #NotOneNight, that nobody shoone spend a single night in jail for trying to self-induce or help somebody have an abortion.
Okay, repeat that, because I think that there's some people who want to write that down. Okay, what's the hashtag?
It's #NotOneNight. As you know, it's again delusional, because I don't think that we're ever going to, you know, get an agreement from people who are prosecuting or whatever, but this is a nonviolent, self-induced attempt to regulate one's own fertility and health and well-being, and we should not be putting people into jail for it.
So I want to toss out just a little bit more in terms of the human rights aspect, the health, a little bit more health data, and then take us back a little bit. We'll go forward again. In Mississippi, a black woman is 118 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than having an abortion. 118 times. According to the state of Mississippi, their own data, 80% of the cardiac deaths during pregnancy in that state are amongst black women. 80%. That's Mississippi data. That's not data that's from some lefty organization, some radical organization, right? And in the backdrop of that, Mississippi defended its law, saying that it's doing this for the protection and the health and safety of women. It's hard to take that as true, which is what Judge Carlton Reeves said in that brilliant order that kept that law from going into effect. And in fact, was it footnote 22? You know I'm a professor, right? Where he says this is just pure gaslighting from Mississippi. But it strikes me that one of the narratives that's been taking shape in this space and that we hear in Justice Alito's leaked opinion is that there's no space in the Constitution that recognizes the kind of privacy that is at stake in Roe, Planned Parenthood v. Casey, or in Dobbs. What's your responses to that? I'll start maybe with you, Roseanne. What's your response to the it's not in the Constitution?
So
does something have to be in the Constitution in order for the court to say that there's a fundamental right?
I think that's what I struggle with is, this return, it's not in the Constitution, but like, look at our lives, like look at our lived experiences. I think the unraveling of privacy rights doesn't touch just abortion, but who you have sex with, who you marry, who you love. So I think it's just complete lies, and I would say a word now that I'm not going to say because we're being recorded, to claim that the humanity of the people in our country isn't found in our founding document.
Right. Anybody else want to touch on that at all?
I completely agree, and I echo that. I think it's just, I find it darkly amusing in terms of which words matter in terms of being part of the Constitution. So, for them to say that it's not for women to make decision about our own body, but it's okay or legal for people to own like assault rifles. And it's just like, that's not even contemplated by the Second Amendment when you look at the history of the text, for example. And I think when we have to look at the Constitution is a living document. It's supposed to frame the way in which we see things and the way we live our lives now. And it's not, I think it's just, they use the term, I guess, as a matter of convenience for when it fits whatever sort of rationale they're trying to reach, unfortunately.
Well, it seems that there's a lot of selectivity, and some might even say opportunism that you see in the leaked draft opinion. But I want to know what you might think of the 13th Amendment within this space, right? Because Justice Alito claims that it was not anticipated or thought of anywhere in the Constitution to relate reproduction. But if you think about the 13th Amendment, it abolishes slavery and involuntary servitude. And it is absolutely no secret that black women's uteruses were used in involuntary servitude. And it is absolutely no secret that the abolitionists who were in the Senate had actually spoken to this. I mean, Senator Sumner from Massachusetts was nearly beaten to death 2 days after giving a speech about black women and rape during slavery. So what do you think about the 13th Amendment within that space, or the 14th Amendment actually speaking to this, and that actually there was text and originalism, because if cotton was king, black women's uteruses were queen?
I mean, I believe it. You've sold me, and I've read, other articles and arguments, including David Gans, who's in the audience, wrote a very good one on the 14th Amendment recently. But you don't need to convince me. And I think that what I'd like to do is see a sort of renovation of our Constitution to add a gender equity amendment or something that really specifies that you can't have sex discrimination, a kind of supercharged equal rights amendment, because I would like to see, I do really believe that we'll get the court back at some point, regardless of the age and the current size of the court. But I want us to sort of modernize, it's not in the Constitution. Look at who wrote the Constitution. I mean, they were not exactly concerned about women or gender or enslaved persons. And so instead of looking and piecing it together, I would love to see us have a long-term plan. And there are state constitutional efforts right now to put a gender equity amendment of different language and different types in different states. And I think that's a really powerful testing ground and step forward. And there's certainly, worldwide, there are a lot of constitutions that have some really good language. not that hard a project to come up with the drafting of it, and I think that is going to take us where we need to go ultimately.
So that's kind of like a third Reconstruction, right? If we can imagine the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments as a first, and maybe the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 65 Voting Rights Act as a second.
I like that. We should have dinner and drinks. That's what
Oh, well, yeah, you know what? Imagine this water is wine, right? Take a sip. They're just watching us as we're doing it. But right, so then what does that third Reconstruction look like? I mean, what is it that needs to be on the table as part of a dignity platform going forward that protects the interest of women, girls, and people who can become pregnant, that protects them from the spaces that we see that we're in right now? What does that look like? What would you want to see?
I mean, so I would start with like within the reproductive justice framework, it's not just the right to be pregnant or not, it's also the right to like parent your children safely, to, you know, have the economic means to like live in a safe community and have investment in your community. So I think it has to be super broad. I guess I also want to say that like, I struggle sometimes when people are like, what do we do next? And it's like, a lot of this work is being done. Like, I live in a state that has a very powerful progressive movement. We're really getting it put to us right now, but like the people doing the work on the state level, I think, have visioned out a lot of these things. And so I'm hopeful that we're not just going to talk about abortion or whether or not you can be pregnant, but it's going to be how can you be a healthy parent and family, and like, especially from a racial justice and economic justice perspective, what does that take?
Sure. Well, it reminds me of Dorothy Roberts' work and her new book, Torn Apart, which is also a feature of the conversation, if it's a holistic conversation, which is that for so many parents who are low income, there's already the risk that just simply by not having wealth, that they become vulnerable to their children being taken away from them. And one of the chapters in her new book, the title of it is that they take away our children at the Harlem border too. Right, so I think that the point that you're making is really important. So what else, you know, strikes you as needing to be as part of the future of reimagining where we are now?
Well, I mean, I do think the reproductive justice movement has done a blueprint for us in very effective ways. And, you know, as Roseanne was saying, it includes looking at environmental justice issues, it involves a right to education, it involves sort of looking at, you know, we started our movement with this question of choice. And the idea of choice, I think people have rightly moved away from it because it presumes that all factors are equal. But if I'm making a choice that I can't continue a pregnancy because I have a non-traditional job where there's no light duty, I'm gonna lose my job, or I don't have leave, I don't have childcare, I don't have all these things, that's not the idea that, you know, the second wave of feminism, and that's not what we want, is to make that kind of constricted choice of lack of resources. So I think part of what appeals to me about the human rights model is that, you know, our constitutional right, our American history is very much don't tread on me, you know, free to be, free to die in the street by yourself kind of thing. The human rights model really looks to place an affirmative obligation on the government to have the programs, resources, and support, starting with Medicaid expansion, but really going beyond that. And I was actually in Texas with Roseanne the day when Governor Abbott, in response to, I think, some questions about SB 8, started talking about, well, maybe there shouldn't be a right to public school education. And like, I was like, oh my God, he went there. Like, that's the one right that we have in this country, is access to education, and not a great education, but
Also not in the Constitution.
also not in the Constitution. And so you look at somebody like Governor Abbott, who's targeting, you know, new Americans, immigrant families when they're coming here. And I think that that speaks volumes about how, you know, our opposition thinks globally, and we really need to have that kind of, you know, wish list that you're asking us for of, you know, how does abortion not stand alone as an issue, but really work in partnership with other issues?
And there's a question about how do we get there, right? Because there's been resistance for not just decades, but centuries, to looking across the sea to take in advice from elsewhere, right? You know, when the 13th and 14th Amendment were being discussed and debated, there was real resistance to looking at human rights at that time as a platform. And to your point, I mean, when we think about the expansion of LGBTQ equality, right, then we're thinking about Justice Kennedy actually turning to the tools of international law and being successful there, but you know, I mean, there's optimism and then there's real optimism, right? How likely is that either through Congress or through our courts that there is an embrace of international human rights principles?
Well, I object to calling them international because I think they are
Fair
human
point.
rights principles.
Fair point.
They're just a little bit neglected in this country, but I think
Significantly neglected in this country.
Yes, and especially by lawyers. And I think that when you talk to people individually about why they support access to abortion and why they support access to the decision about whether and when and with whom to have a child, it is a fundamental understanding of it. It is extremely personal. I mean, it is one of those issues that hits everybody, not just because 1 in 4 women will have an abortion in her lifetime, and my statistical data is 1 in 1 woman will have a pregnancy scare in her lifetime, and I think that looking at our human experience and what I've seen in Ireland and in the green wave countries of Colombia and Argentina where abortion has been liberalized, it has been exactly like the reproductive justice movement in this country of a basic understanding that's not looking to, it's in this treatise or in this declaration, but really that understanding of a rights-focused, wanting to do away with gender stereotyping and gender restrictions and have that kind of new approach.
But it still raises the question, how far off would that be? And what do we need to do to actually get there? Right.
I think it will be, I think things would have to be pretty bad for us, honestly, to get there.
Is it not already there, Erin?
I think right now it's bad kind of for a lot of people, especially those who are living in this area. It's bad figuratively in terms of what you might see on the internet, but it doesn't feel up close and personal. So, I mean, you may have a different experience in Texas. No, I mean, you have a different experience in Texas, but I think for a lot of the folks who are living in the states that have the large Democratic majorities, they're not seeing it and experiencing it in the same way. So I think if it were to happen there, then you would have folks turning to try to embrace the broader human rights principles. But for now, it's just it's abstract, I think, for a lot of people still. And I think once we, unfortunately, just because of the way America works, things have to get really bad before people try to address issues. We see this with the baby formula, for example. We knew when they shut down the factory that it would lead to an issue, but it wasn't until we actually saw mothers and babies being harmed before people made a choice to try to address it. So I think for now, it's not until we start seeing more of the harms and kind of the cumulative impact of it for folks to actually try to start making that bigger, broader push to say, like, how can we fix our Constitution? What sort of human rights treaties do we need to adopt?
So in the immediate, there are lots of questions, but a couple of questions that are really on a lot of people's minds. One, are there other areas of privacy that are at risk with the dismantling of Roe? If Roe is dismantled, what other areas of privacy should people be concerned about? And the second is, whether what's happening in states like Colorado, California, New York, Illinois, what might that end up looking like, the kind of free states or sanctuary states? But first, the other areas of privacy that have come under attack or may potentially come under attack, what are those areas?
Oh no, Justice Alito's draft says everything's fine. I think when you're looking at the text of the Constitution and saying there's no right to privacy, then the right to access contraception for both married and unmarried people, because that used to be a thing in our country, LGBTQ plus rights, starting with marriage rights generally. There's a whole host of decisions in the court's history that really are protecting the most intimate privacy rights. Even the decriminalization of homosexuality was based on privacy rights. So, I think that Justice Alito's draft protested too much, saying everything's fine, and there's no legal basis to say that. If there's no real distinction, and Alito's distinction was in his draft, and this could change, was that the distinction is that there is a, quote, unborn human being at stake in the abortion debate, and not in these other categories, which we've seen anti-abortion opponents misconstrue certain methods of contraception as being abortifacients. So there's that immediate
like
problem.
IUDs,
yes.
a very popular form of
and
birth
some
control.
methods of oral contraception. And I mean, I don't want to bring everybody so far down on a Friday
I know,
afternoon.
people are
I think
depressed here. I didn't
have to
intend
get
for
to the
this to
solution.
happen, that people would,
But,
yes.
but I do think we are bottoming out, so to speak. And I think when I talk about sort of using the human rights model, a lot of it is, let's not talk about this as a religious issue, because it's not. Let's not talk about it as this great philosophical, when does life begin? But let's talk about it and what it means to us. And as we're bringing in more people into this movement and building this movement, the nice part of this, and I'm sure you all have had this as well, and others in this room, is since the draft leak, the number of people, oh my God, what can I do, and where can I give money, and how can I give pro bono legal services, has delightfully skyrocketed.
Dramatically increased. So Rose, in Texas, but sort of back to these issues of privacy and what's at risk, are there any particular areas in Texas, kind of alarm bells that have been rung within this space that are concerning for you and those that you work with?
Sure. So I just want to give an example of like what it was like the first week SB 8 took effect, because to me that was these issues. So we run a hotline for teenagers that usually gets a dozen calls a day, dozens of texts for birth control, pregnancy scares. Like going through that alone is awful. It was silent. People were terrified to even get information. And then after the first week, we got a huge 3 times increase in requests for emergency contraceptives because people are scared of getting pregnant. And I think this past legislative session, one thing we talked about was, they pushed through their abortion ban. What are they going to do next? I think they're going to ban us from traveling out of our state for abortion care. I think they're trying to trap us. I think they've already effectively said if you help people get abortions, you could be criminally charged. And I think when I worry about like trans youth and everything that they're facing, our community in Texas is so belabored by these laws, and I just came from the parental rights panel. I think they're gonna come for families and for the way that we live our lives to keep us oppressed, to keep us from voting out these lawmakers who are really trying to keep us down. So I think it's gonna touch everything, and I think that's why abortion is everyone's issue. Mm-hmm. It is an issue that has been so marginalized, and even like, to be super honest, this panel is called Reproductive Rights, and all we're talking about is abortion. Like, maybe we should be saying abortion a lot more, and maybe our progressive spaces need to say abortion a lot more. And so I know the question is like, what else are they coming for? But like, marginalizing abortion this way for the past 30, 40 years in progressive spaces has led us to where we are today. So it's not like, what else are they coming for? It's like, shore up for this right now, because that's how we got here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. And especially the intimate view of what you've been seeing within the organization that you run, and it's doing such important work with youth, which is really critical in this draft opinion and also in oral arguments. Not once was incest actually mentioned, even though it's a feature of both the laws, SB 8 and then also the Mississippi law as well. And children are left out of this, even though, as you know very well from where you work, that there are children in this country that are affected and will be affected by whatever the Supreme Court does.
And if I can speak to that, so the abortion rate for adults in Texas dropped by 50% the first month that SB 8 was in effect. It dropped by 70 to 90% for youth. So when you think about who's being forced to stay pregnant, it is young people. And I serve 80% of our clients are young people of color. So I think youth are going to be deeply harmed, and they also, have seen all of us enjoy this right, and yet we're taking it away from a generation that is so much better than us. Like, I really have faith. My hope comes from the young people we serve, because the majority of Americans, majority of Texans believe abortion should be legal, but when you look at it from an age range, like folks in their 20s and teens, they don't even understand why we're having this conversation. Of course it should be legal, of course it should be supported. So when I get hopeful, it's about young people.
Yeah.
And they're not as tied to the gender binary either. I
Yes.
think that's what's so
Exactly.
interesting too, because it is, part of the thing, I think, when Roe is overturned, there's going to be a lot of anti-abortion folks with time on their hands. And so we are seeing more and more of a move towards this kind of control. I mean, my book is Controlling Women, tongue-in-cheek, but controlling gender stereotypes, controlling gender roles.
Because it's not just women. There are people who are non-binary who become pregnant and who need these services as well. All right, just in terms of time check, if you have a question that you'd like to get to the panelists, this is the time now to write that question down, raise your hand, and someone will come and get that card and then get it on up to me. So, and it looks like there's someone that's already over there. So before we get to those, the last question that I want to pose to you is that there are states that have proposed themselves to be safe havens. So, Erin, what's your sense in terms of how that's going to work out? Because if Roe falls, immediately in the wake of it, there are going to be states that will have laws that are triggered, which either remove abortion access altogether or that severely limit it. So what's the hope behind states like California, New York doing what they're doing? And will it be easy for people who are in Mississippi and other states to actually be able to utilize and get to those services?
I hope through your work it'll be easy. And I think definitely the abortion funds, from what I'm hearing, have been planning and preparing for this. So my hope is that, I know it won't be easy necessarily, but my hope is that it will at least improve and increase access for a lot of the women that are living in the states where the abortion bans are going to go into effect immediately. I think it'll definitely be, we're also seeing those states are increasing their funding as well for abortion services, which is great too. So hopefully with the increased donations that we're seeing to abortion funds, and as folks continue to share resources about abortion, and also for medication abortion in terms of where that can be mailed to, which I think you may be able to speak to a bit more.
Sure, yeah.
But I think we'll hopefully see a smaller drop in access, hopefully. I'm being optimistic.
Okay. Well, what we're going to do is go to some audience Q&A, and I'm going to ask for quick responses to these questions. Seems like a game show, maybe. Even though there's nothing games-worthy about any of this, but these are important questions. So first quick question, what needs to change about progressive legal community in order to solve these crises? Anybody want to take that?
Oh, I'll go. I mean, I think we talk a lot about red states and blue states, and there is a lot of alignment with anti-abortion politics, but there doesn't have to be. And I don't mean to, offend any sacred cows, but we don't have to turn every state from red to blue. We have to turn states from red to, supporting abortion rights.
And I'd add to that, I think messaging is important, and going on an offensive message that actually works, because I think a lot of the progressive messaging has been a bit reactive to things, and I think now if Roe is struck down, that we'll see an opportunity to build that framework and our vision for the future and what that looks like, and sharing our broader progressive views.
Erin, for you, given how important abortion funds have become, how will SB 8 or the Dobbs opinion threaten the ability of those funds to help people access abortion? Or do you see these funds as relatively shielded from new court rulings, legislation that can be harmful?
We think it's for me, so I'm going to answer.
Okay, yeah. Well, I targeted that one. I thought you did that, yes.
Okay, I'm going to say something that's depressing. I don't think we're shielded. I think you're going to see a lot of funds being forced to temporarily close or have to pause our services if we're living in states with abortion bans. And I'm saying that because, God, I told myself I wasn't going to cry. We're there. I know we were saying, maybe it doesn't feel like we're there to folks who don't live in those states. We're there. I can't help people. I'm going to be criminally prosecuted for helping people get out of the state to get abortions. And I have a majority BIPOC staff. I'm not going to put them at risk, but we're there. And so I think the states that have safe access, they're going to have massive expansions of the ability to help people in our states get out. And I cannot envision living in this world this way. So we also have to, while the practical support and abortion funds are doing their work, we need our progressive spaces to be changing these laws.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. Erin. Thank you. Erin, as part of the holistic conversation around post-Dobbs activism, what stakeholders should be part of the conversation but often aren't at the table? who should we be talking to that we are not? Great question.
I think within our broader coalition, there's been more community building amongst repro advocates and voting rights advocates, and I think that that's like a synergy that can continue to be built up. So I think that's definitely an area that we'll hopefully see that continued partnership, because I think it's going to take a broader democracy reform. And I think we see this with all of the issues that we care about, from the environment, healthcare access, abortion rights, contraception access, LGBTQ rights. I think they're all united, and I think within our broader civil rights coalition, we see that unification. So maybe I'm a bit, because I'm within that coalition, I see us having those communications, and I'm hoping that that synergy builds out within the broader public as well.
A quick tag on to that. Do you see this time as also being a threat to our democracy overall, and if so, why?
Yes. I think when you look historically at the courts, especially for people of color and especially for the rights of Black people, the Supreme Court has historically played a role in expanding our rights and ensuring that we were seen as equal in a way that in which, because Black people have been a minority group within the country forever, we've never had that voting bloc power. And I think when you have the Supreme Court that is eroding rights of people, especially for women and anyone who's accessing abortion care, if you do not have the political power to change the laws, then I think it reorients how we'll see the court going forward. And I think that's part of the reason why in the draft opinion he tried to say everything else is okay and fine, and he tried to draw an analogy between Roe and Plessy v. Ferguson, because I think a lot of folks have been concerned about whether or not Brown v. Board might be overturned. And I think whether or not that's true with his posturing, it definitely puts our democracy, I think, at risk when we know that we may not have the voting power to overturn the laws or get the laws passed. And we do have a lot of work to build that messaging in the community and the activism to get the laws passed if the court is not going to uphold our rights under the Constitution.
Julie, quick question. SCOTUS didn't have to grant cert in Dobbs in the first instance, right? So the whole purpose of granting cert was to dismantle Roe, or is there another way to view the Supreme Court getting involved in that case?
I honestly can't think of another reason. I mean, they've been foaming at the mouth, and Planned Parenthood versus Casey was before the court right after Justice Thomas was confirmed, and I think everybody thought it would happen then, and it almost did. But Justice Kennedy had to switch. This is part of a very long, well-planned plan to overturn Roe, and I think the fact that we have 50 years of a right that people have relied on and is now about to be dismantled really does bode badly for. There's nothing you can assume is sacred to this shameless court. Okay, that sounded really dramatic, but still, I can't see another
dramatic
reason
times
for it.
Right?
So.
I mean, it's dramatic when we have the health data that exists, and that the bans are in places. In Mississippi, there's already just one abortion clinic, and with such stunning and horrific data with regard to maternal mortality there, it's hard to get around looking that squarely in the face in terms of what it is. And I think particularly because women of color are affected by that, and particularly because Black women have been rendered invisible in these conversations, I think it's important to just be honest about what that is, and it is horrible. Erin, what are the most critical points for folks to become aware of post-Dobbs in states with trigger bans? And Roseanne, I'll ask you to take that on too.
So I'm going to say some websites. I think you should know where your
Get
local abortion clinic is.
Okay.
So ineedna.com is a list of abortion clinics across the country. It's going to be updated in real time whenever the decision does come out. So ineedna.com. And I want to also say abortionfinder.org is another verified list of abortion clinics. And some of them also list like the abortion funds that you could call, or any laws you need to take into consideration, for example, parental consent laws. So if you're under 18 and you live in a state with parental consent law, you actually have to go talk to a judge and get an order and says, you can go ahead and consent to your abortion and then get your abortion. So it's important to know where we're sending people. And so, for example, I live in Texas, and New Mexico is the closest state, will probably still have abortion care and also doesn't have a parental consent law.
Julie, a lot of people talk about adoption or baby drop boxes as solutions to not having an abortion, and in fact, Justice Amy Coney Barrett signaled that. But pregnancy in and of itself, this, as is noted here, is highly invasive and traumatizing. How do we talk about that and get that point across to the other side? Someone right.
I'm not sure there's a lot of common ground with somebody who's willing to minimize pregnancy and says that safe haven laws is a way forward. And I also think we have a majority of people who support the right to abortion in this country. So I would rather, I think, that people have conversations with people who will listen and who have some perspective. Yeah, we're in a very polarized time right now, but we're not that far right now. And I think there's such a stigmatization and a silencing around abortion. And so when we look at this as the rights issue that matters to us all so much, and how it's a gender equity and race equity issue, it changes the conversation. And I would like to see us sort of model what marriage equality has done, what Black Lives Matter has done in getting Pepsi or other corporations to really join us. I mean, that's who's not at the table a lot. Like these, we have a lot of people in this room and in other rooms who care deeply about these issues, but they're being silenced within their own company and framework. And so, the nice thing about talking to lawyers is, I know that Roseanne and many other funds need legal services, and they need pro bono legal services. They've needed them since September 1st when Texas came down, because to have her sitting here thinking about whether she or her staff or the people they serve will be criminalized is something that we should all be concerned with.
I have one final question because I'm
yeah,
short on time. All right, so a final question is about a silver lining, because hope does matter, and this has been very dispiriting, not this session, although I take it that some of this has been quite depressing. But what is a silver lining that you see going forward, and in light of the last couple minutes that we have? And I'll start with you, Erin.
Sure. I think this moment is our chance, as I mentioned before, to go on offense. And this is I'm a gardener, so I will say it's our chance to plant our seeds and water them. And just like if any of you do garden, you know that you can't dig out your seed and check it to make sure that it's growing. You have to plant it and water it and cultivate it and take care of it, make sure it's getting its sunlight. And I think that's what our opportunity is right now to do with the abortion rights movement, reproductive rights, and our broader civil rights, is to go on offense, plant our seed, and just cultivate our garden, and it will bloom and grow.
Thank you so much for that, Erin, and thank you so much for being with us. And Roseanne, what do you see as a silver lining?
So I'll just give a story of a client, because that's usually where I get my hope. So we helped a teen get an abortion when she was 16, and that was about 3 or 4 years ago, and she just sent us a photo of her new baby, because she now is a parent with a wanted pregnancy. And I think about abortion as that. It's a moral good. It lets people live free and healthy and happy lives. And abortion's not going away. Just because it becomes illegal doesn't mean people aren't going to need it. And so I know that we will take care of us. We are a community.
Thank you so much for being with us. Really, really appreciate it, and the work that you do with youth. All right, Julie.
I would say the fact that people care now more than ever, and I do think everybody can do something. Somebody who works for Orly Nail Polish created You Don't Control Me Red. That is, the proceeds go to an abortion fund in LA. Everybody has something in their life. We all need to kind of look at the world through abortion rights goggles and figure out what we're going to do and how and what fits.
Thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists for joining me. For this closing plenary, and thank you all for your attention and your care and your commitment, not only to these issues, but the issues that we hold dear at ACS. Thank you so very much for being with us. And we're going to exit stage this way. All right.